So we're now on episode number 4 of the series we're doing on the life and times of John W. Taylor. On this episode, Michael Ness and I cover a part of Mormon history where the tide really begins to change on the church's unofficial stance on plural marriage. Now, there are two things that really come through on this episode. One is the kind of band of brothers mentality that some of the more ardent defenders of the principle had in the Quorum of the 12, and even more inspiring than that is perhaps outside of Joseph Smith a personal Christ-like sacrifice made by John W. Taylor, and ultimately a betrayal of that sacrifice by some members in the Quorum of the 12 that really gets my blood boiling and causes me to become just a little bit spicy. Stick around for that and more on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Look, it's no secret that our society has become much more crude and coarse. To become and raise men and women of virtue and character is a Herculean task. To help with this, I have recently wrote and published a book. Now, back in the 1700s, Washington had a book called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. It was a book with 110 rules that talked about how to conduct yourself like a civilized person in society, something that today's society is sorely lacking. What I did is I went back through the book and I reinterpreted his original sayings for the 21st century. So the book is laid out in a way in which you see Washington's original rule. Right below that is my explanation for the 21st century, and below that you'll find 2 or 3 examples of where to use this in the real world. Now, to go along with this, there's a workbook that helps parents teach these principles and practices to their kids. To find the book, go to MormonRenegade.com, go to the bottom of the page, search out the blog post, and order your copy today. I can bear personal testimony from personal experience that this is an invaluable tool to help you raise men and women of virtue and character. And we're back again.
Howdy, Dave.
How's it going?
Pretty good.
Good. So where did we leave off last time? We left off where exactly?
I was gonna ask you that question. Did we talk about the division of the Alberta stake in Canada?
Yes. Yep, we did.
So maybe we'll just recap there and go forward. Although I would like to make a little bit of an apology or a disclaimer. I was listening to episode 2 at work with my brother-in-law and some friends, and as I was hearing our back and forth, I realized I said something that I didn't like how it came out. I was talking about how some of my source material came from a book published by Steve Murphy, and I said that he had been excommunicated from the AEB, and I just left it at that, and it sounded bad. And I don't want to. I feel like I should say that I only stated that because that had reference to not to any moral issue, but because of the turmoil in the AEB website that was going on for a few years when they had the split with Pinesdale and with if I'm remembering correctly, he voiced his concerns regarding leadership being accountable through a trial by a high council type format.
Okay.
And he voiced his opinions enough times on that I believe they disinvited him from attending meetings and then offered a formal excommunication. And the only reason I stated that was because I thought, well, wanted to be clear, but also that there's a little bit of irony in the sense that fundamentalism was born out of the idea that, well, even though the church excommunicated us, we didn't lose our priesthood.
Right.
And so I thought it was a little funny to be excommunicated formally from a priesthood group that's not technically a church. But on the other hand, I don't think that you couldn't essentially excommunicate someone through gross misconduct or other issues. He's, those things are necessary to do sometimes. I'm not saying it was necessary in his case whatsoever, but he put together two really good books that I have. Um, I've only talked to him the one time when I talked to him about those, but he put together a really cool book. I think he just called it Conference Reports, but it was essentially laid out the way Mormon doctrine by Bruce R. McConkie was laid out by
Okay.
topic, but all the references are Journal of Discourse references.
Nice.
And then the other one was what I've been using for some source material for the earlier episodes, which was George Q. Cannon's journal that he reproduced, which was awesome.
Nice. Okay. No, we got that out of the way. It's always good to lead with that sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, I listened to that and I was like, oh, that might have felt like a character assassination or something, and I in no way, shape, or form meant to assassinate anyone's character by saying that.
Okay. Yeah, no. So what was his name again?
Steve Murphy,
Okay, he's good in our book. We'll just go with that.
he's
So,
good in our book. Yep, absolutely. All right, so leaving off or around the time we left off, in August 30th, 1903, the Alberta stake was divided, and Heber Simeon Allen was asked to be the new president of Taylor Stake, which was centered in Raymond, Alberta, Canada. Um, and a number of authorities, including Matthias Cowley, John W. Taylor, Anthony H. Lund, Reed Smoot, and Joseph F. Smith, came to Cardston to divide the stake. And sometime during their visit, John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley convinced Heber Allen and Edward J. Wood to both enter into the principle of plural marriage. E.J. Wood becomes the first president of the Cardston, Alberta Temple, as well as being the stake president. And at President Wood's death in 1956, President David O. McKay, who was president of the church, then told Hugh B. Brown that we have never had a greater president of a stake than Edward J. Wood.
he's a
And
polygamy.
he was a polygamist. Both of those guys, both stakes there presided over by polygamists, and a great stake president in the case of E.J. Wood. And he would visit his second wife in Salt Lake City at least twice a year for conferences and stay with her during those. So it was still pretty underground for pretty much the rest of his life. And that's just crazy to me. But it shows commitment.
What year did he die?
1956.
Okay, put that in context.
And he entered into the principal sometime after August of 1903.
Yeah, but yeah, just put that in context, right? In 56, who was president of the church? Was that David O. McKay?
Yeah.
Okay. And he knows. There's no way he doesn't know.
It's likely he probably knew. I mean, I think we mentioned this last episode, but yeah, I mean, we know from Joseph Musser's Inquisition in 1909 that David O. McKay was noticeably nicer to Joseph Musser than others. Same with Rudger Clausen and Orson F. Whitney. They were friendly, even defending Brother Musser during that time period. And there are those stories about David O. McKay entering into the principal. We know that Orson F. Whitney entered into the principal, and we know that Rudger Clausen entered into the principal post manifesto.
Right. And I think I brought this up when we recapped it. There is a lot of accounts that people would go talk to David O. McKay and be like, what's this Adam God stuff? Or, ask questions about polygamy. And then magically, that couple would get a call from Allred or somebody else. And so, yeah, those relationships weren't always as icy as they are today.
Sure. No doubt about that. Yeah, there's indication, and I don't know how long he was president of Boise Stake, but there was according to those early fundamentalists, one of them being Carl Jensch. He gets involved with John Woolley in 1928. Well after the time period we're talking about, but he talked about being told by Joseph Musser that Heber Q. Hale, who was president of the Boise stake, was set apart by Joseph F. Smith to perpetuate plural marriage in about 1917 or so. And I don't know how long he lived or was president of Boise stake, but there's that, you know. So,
Yeah.
and I don't know what activity. I haven't ever dug into that. That's something that might take, you know, future research. Let's see. On September 11th, 1903, um, Joseph F. Smith told John W. Taylor to authorize Patriarch John A. Wolfe, who was a former bishop and member of the stake presidency, um, to perform a plural marriage for Franklin D. Leavitt. Um, 8 years later, in 1911, when asked about it, John W. Taylor told the 12 that he was under orders to do that. In particular, Matthias F. Cowley was a brother-in-law to Patriarch Wolfe, and also um, made mention of it in his fellowship trial, saying, "All I know, I think a brother Leavitt went to President Smith and asked him if it would be all right if he referred to brother Taylor, who had charge of all things in Canada." Um, yeah, that's what he said. And D. Michael Quinn says, supporting evidence for President Smith's authorization of these Canadian plural marriages from 1903 onward is found in the fact that the records of these ordinances have been kept under First Presidency control.
Oh. Yeah, yeah, they don't want that getting out, right? I mean,
Sure.
if that gets out, there's some real questions then starting. You know, the way the current narrative is framed, you know, the manifesto comes out and a few stragglers hold on to it, and then the second manifesto comes out and we're completely done with this. This is not the case. This is not what history
No,
shows.
no, and we're getting into the second manifesto time period really quick. It's on. We're right in front of that right now, and we're going to see just how much that it's not the case, and it's going to blow your mind. But yeah, so speaking of record books, so Quinn is saying that there was a record book kept of the authorized Canadian marriages. I'm assuming, and maybe I'm assuming incorrectly, that that was kept by Brother Wolfe, possibly maybe by others like E.J. Wood, who was the temple president, the stake president. I don't know, but we have plenty of what they called out of temple sealing record books. Anthony Ivins kept one. Um, Alexander F. McDonald kept one. Both of those were down in Mexico. So it's no stretch of the imagination to believe that they were keeping that in Canada as well. Matthias Cowley had a record book that was turned into the church at one point. Um, I, I wouldn't doubt that John W. Taylor had one if Matthias Cowley had one. George Q. Cannon's journals have been published, although some are redacted or pages have been removed. But from a book that D. Michael Quinn was going to publish before he died, he stated that there is a memorandum book of George Q. Cannon's that is hidden away still, and no one has seen it. So it makes me wonder what's in the memorandum book. I don't know. Um, in any case, the drama continues. Going into September 14th, that same year, 1903, leaving Canada, Joseph F. Smith and those with him traveled to Wyoming, and Wyoming had been under the colonization efforts of Abraham Owen Woodruff. And in a meeting in the Bighorn Stake in Wyoming, Joseph F. Smith listened to John W. Taylor give a public sermon defending polygamy, after which Matthias F. Cowley performed a marriage for the stake president there.
While Joseph F. Smith was there.
While Joseph F. Smith was there. Yeah.
Interesting.
The date I have for John W. Taylor performing that plural marriage for the new president of the Taylor stake up in Canada is 5 days after that sermon. So I guess he goes back up to Canada and performs a plural marriage for Heber S. Allen and his second wife. So then later that month, to September 25th, 1903, general board member of the YMMIA, I believe is the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association, a guy named Joseph W. Summerhays marries his fifth wife. Now, if you remember from last episode, he had had a conversation with a bishop from Springville and Joseph F. Smith 5 years previously about whether it was okay to enter into plural marriage.
Yep.
And he was told by President Smith that there was ways that that could be accomplished. So 5 years after that, he is married to his fifth wife in Chicago, Illinois, by Matthias Cowley.
Wow, in Chicago.
Yeah, it must have been some sort of business trip.
Yeah, there was some business.
Um, yeah, there's some business for sure. The Lord's business.
Yeah, yeah, there was some business happening. The Lord's business.
There's a journal entry in Rutger Clausen's journal on October 10th, 1903, where he writes that he talked with one of his wives about marrying another plural wife and received her permission to do so.
It's all over the place, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it just doesn't end. It just like those who are desirous to enter the principle at this time period, all you gotta do is ask, bro. Right? Like we're not telling you you should, but all you gotta do is ask, and things will happen.
The unfortunate thing is that probably because of that, we get the problems in the Reed Smoot hearings that come at the very end of this year, which we're approaching, which gets the second manifesto essentially. But we're going to get to that really quick. November 3rd, 1903, the grandfather of current member of the first presidency, Henry B. Eyring, Edward Eyring, is sealed by Abraham Owen Woodruff in Colonia Juarez to his second wife. And I believe, and I'm not entirely sure, that he ends up with a third wife too, but I don't recall at this exact moment. But he writes in his journal, this is Edward Eyring, writes, in 1903, I decided to try and enter into the holy order of plural marriage. So with the help of my wife, I was able to woo my wife's sister Emma. After considerable persuasion, married her in November.
Wow.
And so Owen Woodruff sealed it, and Ivins reported it in his record book.
So they're keeping records of all this. So they're
Yep.
they're still under the understanding or this idea that just hold on to these records because right around the corner this is coming back and we'll need all these
sure.
records, and make sure you guys keep a hold of all these records so that when this happens we can all bring it back in.
No, and look at the family relation. Henry B. Eyring, living today, his grandfather. That was his grandpa.
Grandpa, right? That's like
Yeah.
one person ago.
Yeah, that's one person ago. He probably knew his grandpa. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so think about this, right? Think about this. I'm only speculating. Maybe one of them died before Henry was born, but there's a good likelihood that Henry B. Eyring, he's hanging out with some poligs, right? Like,
big time.
Getting on his grandfather's knee and like, oh, she's my grandma and she's my grandma. I mean, just again, one person ago. This is not ancient history. This is very recent.
No, well, and when you see all the people that his grandfather's hanging out with, I think I got some of that in here. We're going to get into that. So the day after that, we see in Anthony Ivins' journal, because he's writing down that marriage the day before. He writes, we started for Sonora this morning at noon, about 8 miles west of Ramos, camped on the Janus River. Our party consisted of Apostle John W. Taylor and wife Nellie, Apostle Owen Woodruff and wife Avery, John M. Cannon and wife Bishop Bentley. Now, Joseph Bentley had at least 2 or 3 wives post-manifesto sealed to him, by the way. His wife, Maggie, and 4 of her children, and sister Cannon's daughter, Margaret, and sister Eyring. So one of Brother Eyring's wives.
Yeah.
And traveling with Owen Woodruff, John M. Cannon, who we know is friends with Joseph Musser, and John W. Taylor, and John W. Taylor is there himself.
And how many wives? How many wives did Eyring end up with?
At least 2, maybe 3. I don't know, but at least 2. We might cover him taking another one in a minute. I don't recall. But they're also traveling with Guy C. Wilson, who had at least 2 or 3 wives. 2 of them, I believe being post-manifesto, and brother Helaman Pratt, son of Parley P. Pratt, who also was a post-manifesto polygamist, and brothers Dan Skousen and brother Joseph C. Davis, and Don Moroni LeBaron, who was an uncle to Dare LeBaron.
Interesting. So a who's who of not only church membership, but of future fundamentalists as well.
Or people related to future fundamentalists, yes. I have no indication that Don LeBaron was ever involved in fundamentalism, but you can't expect me to believe that nephew and uncle never talked.
No,
No.
no. Right? For some, I get it. They want to keep the blinders on and be like, but it was never talked about. And I'm
Sure.
like, Eyring was sitting on his grandfather's lap, most likely. Maybe he died before he was born. I don't know. But the point I'm making, this is all in close proximity time wise, and all the big names within the church today and prominent fundamentalists, they're rubbing elbows.
Yeah, so let's look at the prominent names here. We got LeBaron, Skousen, Pratt, Cannon, Woodruff, and Taylor, and Ivans. Yeah.
Crazy.
6 days after that, Abraham Owen Woodruff seals a plural marriage to a resident down in Colonia, Oaxaca. Over a period of 15 days that is included in those two entries, Owen Woodruff had performed 3 plural sealings. So he's done 3 down there on that trip. Now entering into the new year, we're in 1904. There was a meeting of after a meeting of the Quorum of the 12, Matthias Cowley and 2 other members of the Quorum met in the Salt Lake Temple to perform plural marriages. I don't have any more record of who was involved or who wasn't besides that. But Matthias Cowley and 2 others accepting, and it was not that's not including John W. Taylor, because John W. Taylor cautioned them, the 3 of them, whoever they were, about being so active in promoting new plural marriages. So John W. Taylor is kind of being a voice of caution in that instance, saying, "Hey, you're in the temple. Whatever you're doing, just don't get caught." You know.
Which, if John W. Taylor has to warn you about being discreet, you might be being a little loud, right? I mean, John W. Taylor is not quiet, right? He doesn't mind rocking the boat a little bit. So it would be a lot like me telling somebody else to watch what they eat. It just, if I have to tell you, maybe you shouldn't have that next Snickers bar, you may want to listen, because look at how out of shape I am. So just take that.
You bring up a point I hadn't thought of there before, that if he's warning you, that's a good question, or a good thing to consider, because it's, yeah, he's not afraid to say what he needs to say when he needs to say it. So now we're getting into the Reed Smoot hearings. On January 16th, 1904, Senator Reed Smoot, and Senator Reed Smoot is a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. I believe he's the only monogamist of the Quorum of the 12 at this point. He issues a flat denial to the Senate committee, which was investigating whether the church was continuing plural marriage, and says under oath that none of the first presidency or the 12 had taken plural wives or lived with their plural wives since the Manifesto of 1890. That is a bold-faced lie.
Brothers.
We've disproved 7 ways to Sunday up to this point in the series. We remember that Wilford Woodruff under oath said the same thing in 1891, but then he turned around in private meetings and said any man who abandons his wives will be handled for their fellowship.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question about Reed Smoot, because I find it interesting. I mean, I have my theories, but they're just theories, right? If the church wanted to place someone in there who was devout, there would have been better candidates than Smoot, right? Because somebody who's not in the Quorum of the 12, part of me doesn't wonder if they didn't have the idea. And again, this is just speculation, Michael, but if they thought, well, we'll just get one of our boys up there and maybe we can make some inroads that way.
You mean someone willing to compromise?
Someone who was willing to maybe make some inroads to take the pressure off of this whole plural marriage thing so they could start practicing it again more openly.
Oh, yeah, it's possible because before this you had a big what to do with B.H. Roberts, who was applying to be state senator as well, but he was a polygamist, and they didn't like that, and then there was a whole deal with him running for that office, and so this was kind of their second attempt at getting one of their guys into public office in the government.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Just the thought I had, right? Because if you were looking at just finding somebody who was a devout, was a monogamist, it would have been way easier to put in somebody else who was maybe prominent in the community, but not necessarily that close to church leadership. I only imagine that it would have you wouldn't have had the hearings, right? By placing a member of the Quorum of the 12,
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, that was,
right? That
yeah.
you're begging for it. So somewhere along the lines, they're feeling like this is going to be worth it, right? And the only thing I can come to is okay, what's the thought process behind this? And it's maybe we get our boy in there who is a monogamist, but might be a little sympathetic towards people living plural marriage, and maybe make some inroads there with the government.
Yeah, that might have been how it started out with. I don't know. I haven't researched the Reed Smoot hearings in depth on, for any other reason than what's tangential to the topic that we're on. That could probably merit its own series. So it went on for 3 years, give or take, the hearings did. And there's thousands of pages of testimonials.
That's a lot of pages for a dude just to dodge questions.
Oh, dude, we're gonna get into some of the pertinent stuff, and you're gonna love it. It's hilarious. And one of the first things that's hilarious to me being right after Reed Smoot issues that flat out denial, Joseph F. Smith was the first witness called, and he flatly admitted afterwards that he had five of his wives give him 11 children since 1890, which just straight up contradicted the testimony that Reed Smoot gave, that he had not been living with his wives, or that none of the authorities had been living with their wives. And so he's had 11 children. We know that Lorenzo Snow, who's dead at this point, he had fathered a few children through that time period. And Heber J. Grant was trying to, and he got caught up into this scenario, and he had to pay a fine. And he told them under oath, he said, um, "Yes, I'm living with my wives, and I'm going to continue to live with my wives until I have a son." And he paid his fine, $5,000, I think, $500 to $5,000, and paid his fine for breaking the law and went on his way.
Is it bad when I think of Heber J. Grant? I just imagine there's like an Anakin evil emperor sort of scenario somewhere where Heber J. Grant just basically pledges his loyalty to the other side. I mean, it's the only thing I can come up with, right? Because he starts out so on board. And
Yep.
then by the end, he's a completely different person.
Yeah, it's weird, man. It's weird. I don't know what complete. I mean, I have a guess, and we talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
It was with that Matthias Cowley promising him, to be a wingman and help him out, and then it never happened. Um, but, anyways, onwards. We're continuing with the Reed Smoot hearings. Um, to get down to the bottom of it, because the whole nation wanted to know, before they admitted Apostle Senator Reed Smoot into the U.S. Senate, whether the church was going to be sincere in its rejection of polygamy. They issued subpoenas for Matthias F. Cowley and John W. Taylor to appear and testify in Washington, D.C. Neither of them obeyed the subpoenas. And Reed Smoot's secretary, named Carl Badger, um, who was compelled by his position to follow the testimony in the hearings daily, expressed his frustration to Franklin S. Richards, which was Smoot's attorney, and he wrote in March of 1904, the committee is insisting that John W. Taylor and Brother Cowley come, and they ought to, but I do not want them to come and lie, and I do not know whether I want them to come and tell the truth. So there you are. Isn't that just ridiculous? Uh,
That's fascinating. Yeah, so during the Reed Smoot hearings, are there any indications that Smoot's testimony rubs maybe some of those who are practicing plural marriage within the quorum the wrong way?
oh, Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor very much felt pretty grieved at this whole thing because it becomes a very much a personal ambition for Reed Smoot by the end of it, where he's going to get that seat in the Senate no matter what it costs anyone else, and
Right.
it ends up costing Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor their positions in the Quorum of the 12.
Oh, that's so fascinating. I would have loved to have seen what their reaction was as maybe they're reading the papers and some of this is coming out.
That's a good question. Um, Carl Badger writes to a guy named Ed Jenkins, who is another political associate of Reed Smoot's in Salt Lake the same month, which is March 1904, saying, "Very few of our people have been willing to admit that the manifesto was a revelation. But I want to see Brother Taylor compelled to make this admission. I think we are greatly indebted to him for all this unpleasantness, if you can refer to a national scandal as such." So Carl Badger's getting pretty frustrated with John W. Taylor in any case, uh, thinking he's to blame over this and not Smoot, which is, I guess
You
you're
know,
entitled to your opinion.
here's an interesting thing, and I have never held Smoot in high regard. I'll get this out of the way right now for a couple of reasons. But one of them is I don't think he was a great legislator. So in 1930, Smoot authors a bill that's backed by Hawley called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of
Mm-hmm.
1930 that makes the Great Depression way worse than it was going to be.
That's terrible.
But that's the truth. You can look it up. He was the guy who helped write the bill. He co-sponsored it. It raised tariffs on over 20,000 items. And what that did is because they were in the very beginnings of the Depression, and it drove the Depression even harder because you limited competition
Right.
in the marketplace. And so, however you feel about what he did up there on Capitol Hill, there's no doubt that he was not a great legislator, and you can make an argument that he is one of the people responsible for the length and the depth that the Great Depression and ended up being.
That's a pretty black mark to have.
Yeah, yeah, but I look at Smoot and I don't think he's one of the boys, right? I don't think he's
No, nor do I. He came from good heritage. I think he was the son of uh, Abraham Owen Smoot, who Abraham Owen Woodruff was named after. And
Mhm.
they were related by marriage to the Woodruff family, I believe. Um, in any case, here's a fun little tidbit of information. So yeah, John W. Taylor was living in Canada during all this because I guess that's probably the only way he could hide from pretty well from the subpoena that's issued for him to appear in D.C. Although he would evade detection and he would travel down to Salt Lake City to see his families down there in Utah, and he would pretend to be his younger brother Moses W. Taylor, and
Uh,
he taught his kids to call him Uncle Mosey while they were out in public.
uh,
And
that's
so
back when you could get away with it before facial recognition software.
he'd go around in disguises pretending to be his brother or something. And anyways, that was pretty fun. So all of this attention brings about what we call the Second Manifesto, which was delivered in conference on April 6th, 1904. President Smith wrote to Reed Smoot that the conference action regarding the declaration was spontaneous, and D. Michael Quinn writes, President of the 70, Seymour B. Young's diary states that those who seconded the motion to sustain the Second Manifesto did so, quote, per arrangement. Among these seconds, meaning people who sustained the vote, were Seymour B. Young, who had performed 2 plural marriages in Mexico under Joseph F. Smith's direction, which we covered already. Anthony W. Ivins, who had performed dozens of plural marriages in Mexico by first presidency authorization. Angus M. Cannon, who was a uncle to Abraham H. Cannon, brother to George Q. Cannon, and Jesse N. Smith, and Moses W. Taylor, brother of John W. Taylor and Frank Y. Taylor. So Seymour B. Young's diary insinuates that Joseph F. Smith gave instructions for that thing to be carried through on a vote.
Let me ask you this. Do you think Joseph F. Smith has a change of heart? Or do you think it's one of these things like, well, one manifesto seemed to do the trick for a while of getting them off our back. Maybe a second will.
I want to see what your answer to that question is going to be as we go on.
Okay.
He continues by writing, by the way he orchestrated the sustaining of the Second Manifesto, Joseph F. Smith sent unspoken but public reassurance to those who had conscientiously entered plural marriage after the manifesto. It is not surprising that some Latter-day Saints interpreted the covert message of the 6th of April, 1904 as applying to future polygamous marriages, the reverse of the document's overt statements, and therefore regarded the Second Manifesto as no more restrictive of new polygamy than the first. Even when he told Anthony W. Ivins that the 1904 declaration applied to Mexico, President Smith qualified it by saying, quote, for the time being.
Okay. All right. So it is an attempt to be like, okay, the first manifesto got the government off our back. Maybe the second one will do the same thing.
Yeah, and I want to recap that last bit for the listeners in my own words. But it looks like Anthony W. Ivins and Joseph S. Smith get into a conversation after this, because we know that some people view the first manifesto as only applying to the United States, and therefore Canada and Mexico was a different situation. So Anthony Ivins, knowing that was some of the opinion being held, asks President Smith, does the second declaration affect Mexico? And President Smith tells him, for the time being.
Okay. Do you think he meant that for the time being, or do you think he just thought business as usual after that?
It's hard to know exactly, because it looks like things are pretty hot at this exact moment. So I could see it being a cool your jets, everyone. For now, we're under the lamp, or under the magnifying glass. And I would like to read it. I suppose we could read it. The Second Manifesto reads, inasmuch as there are numerous reports in circulation that plural marriages have been entered into contrary to the official declaration of President Woodruff of September 24th, 1890, commonly called the Manifesto, which was issued by President Woodruff and adopted by the church at its General Conference, October 6th, 1890, which forbade any marriages violative of the laws of the land, I, Joseph F. Smith, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hereby affirm and declare that no such marriages have been solemnized with the sanction, consent, or knowledge of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I hereby announce that all such marriages are prohibited, and if any officer or member of the Church shall assume to solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he will be deemed in transgression against the Church, and will be liable to be dealt with according to the rules and regulations thereof and excommunicated therefrom. Signed by President Smith.
Interesting. Okay. It often makes me curious why that didn't make it in as official declaration number 3.
Or 2, and then have official declaration be number 3.
Yeah, 2, excuse me, yeah.
I think it might actually be under official declaration 1 in some of the footnotes or something.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure. It might be in there. You're gonna look it up.
I'm gonna look it up. I'm curious.
All right,
I'm
but go.
curious.
So 4 days after the second manifesto is issued, um, General Superintendent of the church schools, named Joseph M. Tanner, marries his fifth wife in Canada's Northwest Territory, which is later the Alberta province, by Apostle Matthias F. Cowley.
Okay.
And they're still members of the Quorum of the 12 at this point, by the way. But right after, 4 days after the Second Manifesto, Matthias Cowley is marrying the superintendent of the church schools to his fifth wife.
Ooh.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
The day after that, President Joseph F. Smith sends a letter to mission president. He's Joseph E. Robinson, if you remember him. He is the mission president of the California mission.
Mhm.
Joseph F. Smith advises him to send his girls to Mexico,
Inter-
naming his wives.
Interesting. So looking, there is no
It's not in
allusion.
there.
It's not there.
Okay.
Maybe they left it out because nobody wanted to raise the question of, well, what was going on there that they had to do a second manifesto?
Yes. Oh man, I mean that's probably true. All right, so there's some interesting activity right on the heels within 5 days of the second manifesto. About a month later, we're in May, and I find this kind of hilarious. May 26th, 1904, Apostle Reed Smoot complained to the first presidency that Abraham Owen Woodruff had proposed polygamously to his wife's niece, his only wife, his wife's only niece, which was her name was Clara Pratt Eldridge.
So he's upset about this.
Uh, Woodruff or Smoot.
Smoot.
Yeah, Smoot. Yeah, Smoot's upset about Owen Woodruff proposing to his wife's niece.
Okay,
I but that's also on the heels of the second manifesto. So we have our boy Owen Woodruff seeking to. He's already a post manifesto polygamist, but he's trying to be a post second manifesto polygamist now.
well, Michael, if you're going to excel, you got to aim high, right? You
Yeah.
can't be half-assing this. You got to go hard in the paint if you want to achieve greatness. Let me ask you this, because we know that um, their commission was kept very compartmentalized within the Quorum of the 12, right?
Hmm.
Which I could see as being smart, right? If you're trying to do stuff on the down low, you don't want everybody knowing everything, right? You want to contain the damage where you can.
Sure.
Let me ask you this. Do we have any records of Smoot performing plural marriages?
Not that I've seen. Mm-mm.
So he might be the first guy who's serious about getting rid of this.
That's kind of the way I've understood things.
Okay.
And then you have others who were for it turn against it. You know, the Reed Smoot hearings were all that's kind of what got Francis Lyman, in that camp. Because we know that he performed that carriage ride sealing for John W. Taylor.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, brother Apostle Owen Woodruff is seeking to get a third wife, but sadly, on a trip to Mexico the next month in June, he dies.
Who dies?
Owen Woodruff.
Okay, that's right. And they deem that appendicitis, right?
I don't think it was appendicitis. I think it was flu, Spanish flu, going around at that time,
Okay.
or
All
something
right.
like that. I think.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure, but he was about 31 or 32 years old.
That's still awfully young to be dying from the flu.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Terrible, terrible. History would be so different if he had lived, I think. July 4th, 1904, Don Moroni LeBaron, age 46, marries his third wife in Burnham, San Juan County, New Mexico, by a verbal agreement or solemn covenant.
Nice. I like that.
So he's a post Second Manifesto polygamist. On July 9th, 1904, Francis M. Lyman writes to Apostle George Teasdale, who's resident apostle down in Mexico, and he writes to him saying, "What has already been done regarding new plural marriages is shaking the confidence of the Latter-day Saints. We are considered as two-faced and insincere." And that's the moment, I believe, where he flips.
Where 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 Lyman flipped.
Francis Lyman flips.
So he flips because he's
The
worried about
public,
the integrity of the church, right? And
the
the
public
integrity
optics.
of members. And see, this is one of those points in this conversation where I go back to don't surrender an inch. Not an inch. If it's a true principle, do not hedge. Because this kind of duplicity always comes back to haunt you. Always.
I completely agree. I completely agree with you.
I understand that Wilford's a good man, right? And he had the best of intentions in signing the first manifesto. But in doing so, he kicked down the door for just this very thing. And if you surrender that inch, you can bank the mile is coming shortly thereafter.
I 1,000% agree with you. It's hard looking at all this, but we have a few more years of hope before it gets completely dismal. Case in point, August 3rd, 1904, Apostle Rudger Clausen marries his third wife, Pearl Udall, in looks like Grand Junction, Mesa County, Colorado, by Apostle Matthias F. Cowley. After that marriage, it looks like, to keep things on the down low, that Anthony H. Lund, who was second counselor in the first presidency, began to act as a go-between for the letters between Rudger Clausen and his new wife. And so she or he would write letters to Anthony H. Lund, a member of the first presidency, on behalf of an apostle who just married his third wife, a post-second manifesto wife, in order to keep things from being discovered.
Well, and that makes sense because if I'm not mistaken, it was Lund who had the meeting in the temple
with 2 years before this.
Yeah, yep. With all those proto-fundamentalists, Musser being one of them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So Anthony H. Lund is our boy.
And it's at that point that Lund says, "Keep your records because this is going to be over soon."
Yep, absolutely. We have, in addition to that, I love this, Joseph E. Robinson, who was mission president to the California mission, all the way into 1908, when Rudger Clausen is visiting California, he takes his wife with him, and he arranges that the hotel that Rudger Clausen is staying at has the adjoining but connected rooms with her listed as a, she's probably listed as a single lady or whatever, but he made sure that their rooms were adjoining.
Nice.
While he was out visiting. So
nice.
That shows you that there's a network going on here, that people that got each other's backs.
Yeah, and not only that, I think this lends credibility to the idea that this isn't something that they take lightly, right? They're willing to go incognito for this. They're willing to go, cloak and dagger over this issue, which shouldn't press on everybody this idea that this was more than just a wink and a nod if you so desired. This was something that they felt like we got to do whatever we can to keep this thing going. And if that means we have to send letters through the first presidency, if this is somebody's got to arrange for my wife to have the room next to me and my first wife, so be it.
Yeah.
They are not going to go quietly into the night on this.
And so that brings me to the question, rhetorically, for you and I, who were either raised and you were converted to the LDS Church. We're told one thing, and we're told that it stopped in 1890. But learning these things, we either learn that either the manifesto was a revelation from God and the brethren were disobedient to it, or it wasn't a revelation from God and they never stopped it. So why should we?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're 100% correct. And look, not that I would ever compare myself to those men, because those
Sure.
men, in a very gospel and holy sense, were the baddest of badasses. They just were, right? They're like, we're gonna keep this going come hell or high water. Okay. If it's good enough for them to have to find some workarounds, what does that mean for guys like you and I? Are
Exactly. Those are the questions we should be asking ourselves.
Yep, absolutely 100%. Because here's the other thing. These guys are getting up there in age, right?
Sure.
They probably could have kept this on the down low, and if they were all about stopping this, they could have said, you know what, we got our wives. This was great while it lasted. Now let us just kind of ride off into the sunset, so to speak. We'll fulfill our callings. We're just the leftovers. I don't think that's the case. Given their age at this time, I mean, Musser not being one of them, excluding Musser. I'm talking just the quorum of the 12 now, right?
Generally speaking, let's see. John W. Taylor at this point would be um, 47.
Okay.
And so he's probably on the younger side. But President Smith, Joseph F. Smith, would be nearly 70. He'd be
Yeah.
69 at this point, if my memory serves me.
Here's the thing, at their age, and let's put this into perspective. This is the early 1900s, right?
Mm-hmm.
At 47, you can maybe bank that you might, if you've taken really good care of yourself, you got another 20 years,
Sure.
right? They're not worried about them. They're worried about us.
Right.
They're worried about their kids. They're worried about this practice has to continue for them, right?
Yep.
And
Sure. I agree.
I think we lose track of that fact, and we let others frame the narrative that these are just very amorous men who want to continue this practice for their own gratification. My argument is Joseph F. Smith is 70. Lund is probably approaching that. John W. Taylor, who's on the younger side at 47, maybe another 20 years left, right?
Sure.
And so then what's the end goal? If it was just you, dude, dust your hands off. You've had a great run, right? I mean, you got your big family like you wanted. You can just fulfill your callings, be the quote leftovers from this archaic practice, and you get to just do your thing. No, 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 no. No, no. If you're going to this length in your twilight years, you're doing it with the idea of the next generation in mind.
Yeah, and we should keep your remarks in mind as we go forward because you're going to see evidence for exactly that if we get far enough. Um, in August, on August 11th, 1904, Brother Taylor marries uh, a counselor in the stake presidency to his fourth wife. In September of 1904, John W. Taylor performs 4 marriages. So he performs one in August. So he's performed 6 or 7 up to this point in his life, and then one in August right there. I think that is number 7, and then there's 4 more between September 20th and September 26th for a George H. Budd and his second wife, and his second wife, and 2 ceremonies for Edwin T. Benyon, who was a counselor in the another counselor in the Taylor State presidency, and he married both of his wives on the same day.
Wow.
And then the last marriage out of that group was for John W. Taylor's brother, Frank Y. Taylor.
Hmm. So yeah, they're still going for it.
They're still going for it.
Second manifesto or not.
On October 8th, 1904, Carl A. Badger, who's secretary to Reed Smoot, writes in his diary, and this is awesome. He writes, A.B. Irving told me that Apostle Owen Woodruff told him that a certain number of worthy people had been commissioned to keep alive the principle of plural marriage. This was in reference to new marriages about which gossip was rife.
Ooh.
So that's a good source.
Yep.
So Owen Woodruff was telling people that people have been commissioned to keep alive the principle of plural marriage. Not only did he prophesy that in Mexico, also reiterating what Apostle Mariner Merrill had said, but he was in the know that people had been specifically commissioned. Um, September 26, 1904, President Joseph F. Smith releases a statement to certain authorities wherein he states that he's withdrawing authority from President Woodruff and President Snow delegated to authorize some of the apostles and others to perform sealings for time and for eternity. That's interesting. I would love to get my hands on that letter because what it does is it admits that Woodruff and Snow authorized certain members of the 12 to perform those marriages. And in Quinn's book on LDS church authority and post manifesto plural marriages, he notes that while this says that he's rescinding the authority of Presidents Woodruff and Snow, it conspicuously says nothing about authority that he himself extended to anyone.
Right. Yeah.
So in the world that they live in of clandestine operations and almost spy thriller events, you're kind of forced to read in the lines of, okay, well, I wasn't commissioned by President Woodruff and President Snow. I was commissioned by President Smith. So I guess that means I'm still good there.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And man, the amount of hoops, and in all honesty, it makes me respect these guys more, right? Because not only are they doing mental gymnastics to figure all this out, keep all these moving parts and pieces kind of coherent, but they're doing things like delivering letters. They're doing things like arranging, you know, um, places to stay for other men engaged in plural marriage. And I can only imagine the amount of love that these men had for each other as well. Right?
No doubt about it.
Like I'm gonna go. These are your ride and die homies, right? These are the guys that have your back and you have theirs to the end. And so I can only imagine the amount of camaraderie and brotherhood that's there.
I completely agree. You remind me by saying that of one of the statements I think I alluded to, or at least a statement similar to one I alluded to earlier, where I quoted President Smith saying in a talk in Idaho, remember that, where he said, "I will lie like hell to protect my brethren."
Yeah.
There is one where um, where in a letter to Anthony W. Ivins, Joseph F. Smith writes that his motto, quote, is always and always has been to protect to the uttermost in my power the rights and the secrets, if secrets there may be, of my friends and the friends of the kingdom of God.
Yeah. Yeah. I can only imagine, right? Because look, it's not really war per se, but it's got to develop that same kind of band of brothers mentality, right? Like it's us against the world, bros. We're going for it. Here we go. And I'll be darned if they didn't actually stick it out together.
I think a lot of them did. The problem is, realistically, as you noted earlier, a lot of these men so well respected in a position of authority are kind of elderly, and as they die out, the torch was not carried as sufficiently as maybe it could have been.
Okay, now I'm going to say something that's going to piss some people off, and I want to apologize ahead of time. Not that I'm saying it, but I have to say it. Just like there were elderly men who tried to keep the principle of plural marriage alive, Today, I believe that within the LDS Church, there are elderly men trying to preserve marriage between men and women. And that torch will not be passed to this next generation because this next generation doesn't want the torch.
Sure.
And I think this is, in a weird way, a repeat of what happened with plural marriage.
That's a good point. That's a really good parallel to draw. But as we've seen a lot of stuff the last few weeks, as you and I noted earlier in our own talking together. But the church is it's struggling. The optics are confusing to everyone. And in my generation, I can speak for my generation, from what I see from my peers and those younger, they're mental. I don't understand it. I don't understand where they're coming from with the trans activity and the, you know, and what is coined as gay civil rights or what have you. I do not understand. It has no place in the plan of salvation, except for if you struggle with those things, you need to repent and you need to make covenants with your God that will exalt you by living your covenants. And there's no other way. You
Look,
and I have to be chaste.
yeah.
You know.
Look, I'm gonna point them out, and then I challenge anybody to tell me that yay, all is well in Zion. You have the new public, the new director of public relations for the LDS Church, who is an avowed trans activist, not trans himself, but trans activist, all over Twitter or X, celebrating gay marriage, celebrating trans rights, the whole ball of wax. That's your boy that's going to go out and talk to the public. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Next, you have a dude, and yes, it's still a dude. I don't care if you did get your junk chopped off. You're still a dude in Arizona who gets baptized. And we also know that there's a second one, and I can't remember where it's from, where the first presidency gives the authority for them to be baptized. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know of at least 4 couples who are practicing homosexuals, married, participating in church, partaking of the sacrament, and holding callings. The writing's on the wall on this. This is coming. And I didn't plan on going in this direction, but seeing the parallels, it's too striking. If you think somebody's going to ride into the rescue on this, you are sadly mistaken. If you're LDS and you want to preserve what's left in the LDS Church, you better start getting darn vocal right now. You better become a major pain in the butt to your superiors, so to speak, or else this thing's on the way. Period. History bears this out. This is like we saw with plural marriage. The guys coming up don't want the torch.
Want to get more out of listening to the Mormon Renegade podcast? Then go to the Mormon Renegade Patreon page or click the link in this episode's show notes for access to one of 3 packages. For $3 a month, Slightly Rowdy option will give you access to ad-free audio. Still not enough? Then for $6 a month, sign up for the Stirring It Up option, which gives you ad-free audio and video as well as transcripts. Finally, for those who really want to get crazy, sign up for the $12 a month full Renegade option, which will give everything in the previous 2 plans plus access to a weekly news program which will break down the news of the day from a Mormon point of view, as well as access to a community page where you can talk about all things Mormon in private. Go to the Mormon Renegade Patreon page or click the link in this episode's show notes and sign up today.
The guys coming up don't want the torch.
No. And people that will carry it will be deemed as radicals. Or, if the word fundamentalist hadn't been, stolen by people like us already, they would be termed fundamentalists.
Yeah.
Which,
yeah.
denotes it's a negative connotation for extremism, which that's the way the world views that term, but that's how they would be labeled. And that's how they will be labeled, even if that term isn't applied.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's on the way. It's no longer a distant mile marker down the road. It's kicking in the door now.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. Are you ready for some laughs now?
Yeah, I am. I am. I spit
So,
fire.
yeah, no, I'm glad you did. I got a little thing from the Reed Smoot hearings, a testimony given by George Reynolds, which is very pertinent. It's very eye-opening and it's very funny. Um, George Reynolds is secretary to the first presidency as well as being a president of the 70s. And the Reed Smoot Investigation Committee, which is examining all, everything that the church is doing that they're trying to hide, they interview him to find out whether the manifesto was intended to be a subterfuge to the outside world, or worse, was it a revelation from God which was being violated? So a Mr. Worthington asks George Reynolds, "You said something about helping to write the manifesto. Will you explain that?" And George Reynolds says, "President Woodruff wrote it in his own hand, and he was a very poor writer, worse, I believe, than Horace Greeley, and he gave it into the hands of 3 of the elders and to prepare it for the press. I was one of those 3. Mr. Worthington asks, "Who were the 3? Mr. Reynolds says, "Charles W. Penrose, John R. Winder, and myself." Mr. Worthington asks, "What did you do? You said you helped write the manifesto, and I want to have an understanding of what you meant by that." Mr. Reynolds says, "The answer came from the fact of the question coming to me whether I had read it and understood it, and I answered that I had assisted in writing it." Mr. Worthington asks, "Did you 3 then transcribe these notes of President Woodruff, or did you rewrite it, or what?" George Reynolds says, "We transcribed the notes and changed the language slightly to adapt it for publication." Mr. Worthington asks, "It contained the substance?" George Reynolds says, "Yes, it contained the substance." And then a senator named McComas asks, "Did you, in transcribing the utterance of President Woodruff, make such change of phraseology as would make it ambiguous so that it might apply to marriages subsequent and not now to living with wives who had been married prior?" George Reynolds says, "No, sir." Senator McComas asks, "It must have come to your mind when you were copying and changing the phraseology whether this is to apply to the future and whether the past is to be expected. Did it not?" George Reynolds says, "No, sir, I have told you honestly what my feelings and opinions were." Senator McComas asks, "It did not occur to you then?" "No, sir." "That required years?" George Reynolds says, "Yes, sir. We wrote it as we understood the president intended, with his manuscript before us." The chairman of the committee then asks, "I do not know, but I may have misunderstood. I understood that this manifesto was inspired." And George Reynolds says, "Well, yes." The chairman asks, "That is your understanding of it?" George Reynolds says, "My understanding was that it was inspired." The chairman then asks, "And when it was handed to you, it was an inspiration, as you understand, from on high, was it not?" George Reynolds says, "Yes." The chairman then asks, "What business had you changing it?" And George Reynolds says, "We did not change the meaning." The chairman says, "You just stated you changed it." George Reynolds replies, "Not the sense, sir. I didn't state that we changed the sense." The chairman says, "But you did change the phraseology." Mr. Reynolds says, "We simply put it in shape for publication, corrected possibly the grammar, and wrote it so that." So there he's interrupted. He cut off, and the chairman says, "You mean to say that in an inspired communication from the Almighty, the grammar was bad, was it? You corrected the grammar of the Almighty, did you?"
It's hilarious that this senator is basically saying the same things we are at the moment, right?
Sure.
I do find that very funny. I find that very ironic.
Yeah, no, and we discussed earlier how Wilford Woodruff wrote a what was going to be the manifesto, and then was, and it was written down by George Q. Cannon in his journal, and then they destroyed the original copy. And then John R. Winder and Charles Penrose and George Reynolds wrote it the way that it stands currently. And I think I read over the original. I don't know if I did. But I guess you can say that the sense was the same, and George Reynolds isn't lying in that sense. But it definitely shows you some of the logical fallacy that we go through, the people in the church go through, to that it was a revelation abolishing plural marriage, which definitely was not understood by the people at this point in time. In fact, we're going to see literally right after this, George Reynolds is going to perform a plural marriage.
He's like, excuse me, Senator, I gotta go marry a couple.
Yeah, no, I'm not even kidding you, dude. Like, you can't make this up.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Excuse me, Senator, I have to go now. I got some church duties I need to attend to. Wink. And out the door he goes.
Right. Oh, man. So going on from that point, we're in the new year again, January 1st, 1905. This is an interesting statement. I found this from a book called The Reed Smoot Hearings and some other subtitles that I don't now recall. But in one of the appendixes, it says that on January 1st, 1905, that President Smith told a bunch of temple workers, ordinance workers in the Salt Lake Temple, quote, that the ordinances of God are more seriously threatened than ever before since the days of Nauvoo.
Ooh.
We have not only the hatred of outsiders, but of men and women professing to be Mormons.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Oh, okay. Let me get my tinfoil hat on for a minute.
Okay.
If you remember, there's a story, I believe Ezra Taft Benson, but don't quote me, where someone asked him if he was worried about someone taking his life. And he pointed to the church building and said, I'm more concerned about what's going on in there, in that
I have heard that story before.
than I am to outsiders. This might be the first time that the utterance has been given that, pardon the phraseology, the barbarians have broke down the gate. And they now are entrenched in the church. And this will play out again and again within the church, where there's this idea of, we just got to keep this together till these old men die, and then we can remold the church into something closer to our heart's desire.
There's an interesting parallel here, and I can't say that it's cause and effect or that it's correlated at all. But it is interesting to note that 1905 is the year that it looks like the temple or the lecture at the Veil in the St. George Temple was removed.
Yep.
As well. So it's been told to me that President Joseph F. Smith in his later years was not a big proponent of the Adam God doctrine. I have never looked into that a whole lot. And this makes me want to almost reevaluate that. If it's connected, it might not be correlated, as I said, for him to say that the ordinances are under threat, but that is the same year that the lecture at the Veil with the Adam God doctrine being explained was removed, which is an interesting idiosyncrasy or synchronicity, I guess you can call it.
Look, these doctrines are so tightly tied together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Adam God, celestial plural marriage, all these things are tied kind of at the hip. And it's been my contention for a long time that a lot of the temple changes were an effort to get rid of the Adam God doctrine. Because if you go back to the old endowment and you take a look, or if you've happened to participate in an old endowment, it is a master class on Adam God. And the lecture at the Veil was the most explicit moment in the temple when Adam God was taught plainly.
Yep, where it explained that the things that you saw about being molded out of clay was symbolic in its nature, and that Adam was born of celestial parents on another world, being made of the dust of that earth, but not of this earth,
Yep.
and so forth and so on. And that he was classified amongst the gods, came to Eden with a celestial body.
Yeah, no, it
Yep,
it is the bow that wraps it all together. And you walk out of the temple in those days understanding the mysteries of godliness like never before. And and my my assertion to all this has been, or my assertion, excuse me, has been that all these temple changes that we have seen have been for one reason and one reason alone, and that is to distance ourselves as far as we can from the Adam God doctrine, period. And you can't have the Adam God doctrine without plural marriage. I really believe that.
I agree.
They're tied so tightly together, and when they're done, like I fully expect at some point they will gut the endowment entirely, and maybe it'll be about Christ, right? And that's not to say that things being about the Savior are bad. I like that, but that's not what was restored, right? That's not what was there,
Indeed.
and and at some point, I think a major gutting is going to happen if that's what the church's end goal is. Why else would you get rid of the murals out of the Salt Lake Temple?
Something's gonna happen one way or another. But I do know from my own experiences that the 2019 changes definitely um, removed Adam theistic elements that were present when I was endowed in 2015.
Were removed?
Yeah,
Yep.
things that were very exalting of Adam in 2015 were no longer there in 2019.
Yep.
And then there's been more changes since then. So going forward, still in January 1905, Francis Lyman goes up to Cardston to tell John W. Taylor that he has been summoned to testify in the Reed-Smoot hearings before the U.S. Senate. And in their conversation, John W. Taylor reluctantly agrees to go, although he tells Francis M. Lyman, "I will tell the truth. I warn you, I'm going to tell the truth." And that night, as Apostle Lyman had a dream of a disaster that would result from John W. Taylor truthfully testifying in Washington, D.C. And the next morning, as John W. Taylor was en route to the railroad, Lyman flips his horse and buggy around to intercept him and tells him not to go.
Look, if your goal is to kind of whitewash things, that's not a bad thing. Because I have a feeling that Taylor would kick over the tables a little bit, right? He would let you know exactly kind of where things stood. Because when you read John W. Taylor, he's not a bashful guy, right? And there's only so much sidestepping that I feel like he's going to do before he's like, okay, let me break this down for you. And
I just want to know how it would have played out. That would have been something. I mean,
dude,
that would have been funnier than what we just read about George Reynolds, writing the manifesto.
dude, when I get on the other side, I want to hang with W. Taylor for a little while, right? I would
Yeah.
I want to be like, please regale me with some of your stories.
Me too, man. Me too. During this time, John W. Taylor's away in Canada. He's got family down there in Utah still. He's able to kind of go down pretending to be his brother, as we discussed, but from time to time. But other times when his family needed help, John M. Cannon would come and help out, and with Frank Y. Taylor, John W.'s brother, and do things like minister to the sick children, take care of the family while John was in hiding. Here is something that Matthias Cowley wrote to his family regarding the Reed-Smoot hearings afterwards. So Matthias Cowley, in remembering the Reed-Smoot trial, wrote, In 1905, the agitation of hireling priests and many misguided people was strong against the seating of Apostle Reed Smoot in the United States Senate. The hue and cry was that many individuals had entered into plural marriage since the manifesto, among others, Brother Taylor and myself. It was therefore thought advisable for us to resign our places in the Council of the 12. Before doing so, President B.H. Roberts had made a speech, I understand, by the request of the presidency, in which he said that unless individuals would shoulder the responsibility of these marriages, the church had not a foot of ground to stand on, and that they were guilty of duplicity and double dealing. We had meetings with the 12 for about 6 days, which the presidency did not attend, except a part of the first one. No minutes of these meetings were kept. That's interesting. In one of these meetings, Elder Penrose said, referring to Elder John W. Taylor and myself, and these are very nearly his words, but I don't say them verbatim. He said, "These brethren are not on trial. They are not charged with disobedience nor transgression, but we've all got in a box with the government and something must be done to meet this fight. And if these brethren are willing to be humiliated, they can be reinstalled." Whereupon Brother John Henry Smith threw up both hands and said, "Yes, I'll vote for them with both hands." This was the spirit of the occasion. We had no arguments against our brethren. After the last meeting, which meetings were held in the temple, Brother Penrose brought our resignations to us, all written, with no suggestion from us, although Brother Taylor desired to write his own. We signed them, and after doing so, Brother Penrose said he had no idea that they would go into effect and would not unless matters came to the last ditch of necessity. This was in the fall of 1905, and at April conference of 1906, they were made public and became of effect.
Holy crap. Holy crap. So they prepare letters of resignation from the quorum.
Yep, in October of 1905, that were held on to for 6 months until April of 1906 when they were issued. Because it was the trump card. It was the last ditch effort. They told Matthias Cowley and John W., we're not going to use this unless we absolutely need to.
Do you think anybody really meant that from on high?
From
Is there
their
any
peers, I do.
indication? Is there any indication in that 6-month window that things got worse and they had to do this?
I don't know about worse as much as they didn't get better than they were, but I do believe that individuals like John Henry Smith, Rudger Clausen, George Teasdale, Mariner Merrill, I cannot believe that those men would not have wanted those men, John W. and Matthias Cowley, to be reinstated. And that's what Charles Penrose said to them, is that you can be reinstated when things calm down. That's what they said as well. So we're not even going to do this, right, unless we need to. And then when things calm down, we'll reinstate you. If it even comes to that. That's what they were told.
Okay. Now I'm going to make a bold statement here. A couple of them.
Okay.
One, the men that signed that resignation letter performed an act of sacrifice that I believe is very Christ-like.
Yeah,
right?
I would agree.
They suffered humiliation for this principle.
Yep.
When asked to make maybe not the ultimate sacrifice, but close, they were like, okay. Next. This is what you get when you surrender ground. Every time. Every single time. And looking back now, it's maddening, right? It's like, stop. Just stop. Okay, you surrendered this. You're on the DL. I get it. But stop. No more. And good on those guys for making the hardest of choices that not only affect them, it affects their wives, it affects their children, right? I mean, Salt Lake's
Oh
not
yeah.
that big of a community in these days, right? I mean, and the reverberations of this echo across Utah and across the Mormon corridor. Good on them, but shame on the powers that be. Shame on the powers that be.
No, I agree with your observations, and I like your reminder of that Christ-like sacrifice because, as we noted earlier in that first episode, that seems to be the pattern for John W. Taylor's life in a big way that mirrors the Savior. And it was their work, and it wasn't just their work, but they bore the brunt of the humiliation and the sacrifice. But them and others there were others who were willing to do as much, I'm sure, and that allowed the principle to go forward. And
Mm-hmm.
I would like to pause from our narrative to make a remark on why that's important. Why is it important that the principle of celestial plural marriage go forward? Because if you go back to the Journal of Discourses and read John Taylor, father of John W. Taylor, read his testimony, and I'm sure there's other testimonies that bear this out, but John Taylor said that after we had been instructed by Joseph Smith in Nauvoo about the principle of plural marriage, we were essentially, this is paraphrasing, we were offended in our feelings enough that we wanted to put off the evil day as far as we could, because they'd grown up in a society where a certain idea of chastity and virtue was held up as paramount, and anything else was offensive. And so they put off entering into the principle until one day John Taylor was riding his horse outside of Nauvoo and met Joseph Smith by the graveyard. And Joseph told John Taylor, if you do not enter into this principle soon, the keys will be turned against you.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? Well, a key unlocks or locks a door.
Yep.
So he's saying that key will be turned against you, locking that door. You're damned.
Yep.
You'll be damned. The priesthood keys will be turned against you, meaning you can't walk through that door exercising them anymore. And so what does Brother Malachi in the Old Testament say? Behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of the prophet Elijah, and he'll place the promises made to the fathers in the hearts of the children, and the hearts of the children will turn to the fathers. Were it not so, the earth will be utterly wasted
Yep.
at his coming, meaning the Lord's coming. And so if those keys were lost, you have two options. But one's really not an option. The hypothetical is they would have to be re-restored, otherwise the earth is wasted. Or they need to stay here. So it's one of the two. But it can't be re-restored because otherwise Joseph Smith did not fulfill his mission in restoring all the keys for the last time.
Furthermore, it turns the Lord into a liar because the Lord gave us assurances that the keys would never be taken from the earth again. And
absolutely.
And so the only other option is that it has to continue on. And gosh, sometimes I'm even astounded by my level of nerdness. It's like that scene out of the first Star Wars where he tells Vader, strike me down and I'll just become stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, that's what happens with Taylor. He doesn't see it in his lifetime, but it's John W. Taylor that really sets the precedent. And that's the other thing. This act of selfless sacrifice and bravery then sets an example for the rest of us, right? Like, what are you going to say when John W. Taylor, the son of a prophet, says, you know what? You want to take my membership? You want to kick me out of the quorum? Okay. But I'm going to die on the hill of principle over and over and over. Now, let's look at the reverse of this. What does this ultimately do? This sets a pattern that, I'm sorry, the LDS Church has fallen into over and over, which is capitulation, which is weak need. Look, if I may have to edit this later, but I'm going to say it now. For so long, I was waiting for somebody up top to let the other nut drop and become a man and stand up for principle, and it just wouldn't happen. It just wouldn't happen. And I figured out after looking at the history, okay, you want the gospel fullness? You better be willing to give some stuff up. You better be willing to walk through the fire, and you better be willing to hold your head high while doing it, or else it won't work. And that's just where it is. On one side, you had a guy who made sure that those keys stayed on earth to fulfill prophecy. And on the other side, you had weak knees. And that weak knee led to the situation we're in.
Yep. Well, I'm certainly grateful for all that was done to perpetuate the priesthood on earth. And that's what we're studying right here. And I hope it's insightful to those people who are listening. So we kind of jumped ahead in our narrative. So that was October of 1905 when those statements were signed. But go backing up to February of 1905, a post-manifesto polygamist named Josiah E. Hickman writes in his journal, "Oh, but our people are howling over the supposed marriages since the manifesto. It is principally those who never believed or entered into plural marriage. It seems that a large percentage of our people are joining hands with our enemies to fight those who have entered into this principle. There is a division between or among the leaders of the church. I am fearful of the threatened consequences." So that's a full 6 months before that. Those resignations are prepared. April of 1905 in General Conference, contrary to Apostle Reed Smoot's wishes, because he's running for senator still, Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor were presented as general authorities, but I suppose Brother Smoot had asked them not to be sustained as general authorities, but they were presented as general authorities regardless. And after one of the sessions, a son of President Anthony H. Lund told Reed Smoot's secretary, Carl Badger, quote, "John W. Taylor has done right, whatever he has done," in reference to the subject of polygamy.
Ooh. Woo, spitting some fire.
So the Lund family is pretty strong, it looks like, on that one. August 5th, 1905, Fred W. Merrill, son of Mariner W. Merrill, marries his second wife, and they are married in the Logan Temple by his father, Mariner W. Merrill. So you have Apostle Mariner Merrill helping his son become a post-Second Manifesto polygamist.
Yeah, but somehow he escapes the wrath.
Yeah.
Interesting.
September 6th, 1905, apparently, I didn't realize this. My notes say that this is information coming from the diary of Edward J. Wood, who's president of the Alberta stake and future temple president up there. The superintendent of church schools, Joseph M. Tanner, marries his sixth wife up there in Cardston, Alberta, Canada.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Post-Second Manifesto.
Post-second. So he's post-first and post-second because he married his fifth wife back in like 1901 or 1903. 1903, when we first started the podcast, he came up on this episode.
Yep.
September 16th, 10 days after that, Apostle Matthias F. Cowley marries his fourth wife in Cardston. It's performed by John A. Wolfe, who was set apart by John W. Taylor and Joseph F. Smith. Patriarch Wolfe also marries Ernest Guy Taylor, and to his third wife, Lily Susanna Hicks. And down in Colonia Juarez in Mexico, on the other side of North America, President Joseph F. Smith publicly announces, so on the same day that Patriarch Wolfe is performing plural marriages in Canada, President Smith announces, quote, "There are no plural marriages being performed at present in the church in Mexico or anywhere else." Hours later, after he says that, in the home of President Anthony W. Ivins, he authorizes Joseph W. Summerhays, who asked back in 1898 and took his second or third, whatever, was his a plural wife, I think it was his third wife, in 1903, he authorizes Joseph Summerhays to marry a former mission president, William G. Sears, down there in Mexico. Right after telling the people there's no plural marriages.
Look, I don't blame people for being confused during that time period. I'm confused now. I'm like, does Joseph F. Smith mean this? And then maybe it's happening unbeknownst to him. What is going on?
That's tough. But I mean, but here these guys, like Joseph Summerhays, Joseph M. Tanner, Henry S. Tanner, Joseph E. Robinson, who's helping out with, Brother Clausen, like these people are interconnected at this level where it's okay, at least I mean, to be instructed, not only, I mean, the traditions that we get, the things that we've heard is when Matthias Calley or John W. Taylor would go to President Smith and ask, can I take another wife? As president of the church, I can't tell you can't.
Right.
But then here we have him explicitly instructing Joseph Summerhays, who was traveling with him on this trip to Mexico to go perform a plural marriage.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think Joseph F. Smith dies holding on to this?
Probably.
Okay.
From what I've heard, yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
From what I've heard and what I know, I absolutely think so. October, see, we're back to October now. That's when the Council of 12 meets to deal with Matthias Calley and John W. Taylor. They signed that on October 18th and 19th, 1905. December of 1905, George F. Gibbs, a secretary to the first presidency, writes to Senator Smoot, saying, "Brethren, beginning to feel that John W. Taylor and Cowley should not be sacrificed unless required by the Committee of Privileges and Ejections to save you."
Ooh.
So it's against the feel of the quorum, generally speaking, to even announce that had happened. On December 8th, he sends George F. Gibbs, secretary to the first presidency, sends an encrypted telegraph to Apostle Smoot advising him, "When you become convinced that action should not be delayed any longer, let us know. And I feel to say to you that if you will cast aside forever all thought of making a sacrifice out of Apostles Taylor and Cowley, you will begin to see your way brighten, for such a thing cannot be done simply in the hope of avoiding drastic legislation, nor for the purpose of convincing friends that Joseph F. Smith is honest."
So
they're flat out.
They're getting warned. Don't do this.
Yep.
And if you don't do this, you can expect blessings to come.
Yep. So that's probably coming from President Smith trying to save Taylor and Cowley's butt.
Yeah.
Because as we saw from Matthias Cowley earlier, the first presidency did not attend those meetings of the Quorum of the 12 where that was discussed.
Okay. Again, tinfoil hat time. Now you have to wonder, was this the moment that there was a takeover by the 12 in spite of the first presidency?
It could be. I think Francis M. Lyman is president of the Quorum of the 12. I can double check that real quick if you want me to.
Yeah, because I think this shows motive and intent, right? If the first presidency is not privy to this message, to this meeting, and next thing you know, they're given a document that, because now I'm having second thoughts, right? Now I'm like, okay, maybe they were serious that yes, you'll have to be humiliated for a while, but then we'll bring you right back up. I'm starting to think they never had any intent of bringing them back aboard.
So let's look at the roster here of general authorities. At this point in time that we're dealing with, this Francis M. Lyman is president of the Quorum of the 12. He became president of the Quorum of the 12 after the death of Brigham Young Jr. on April 11th, 1903. So Brigham Young Jr. was president of the Quorum of the 12 up to that point from whenever he became president of the quorum. Members of the quorum of the 12 at this point are Francis M. Lyman, John Henry Smith, he's pro polygamy.
Okay, Smith
George Teasdale, he's pro polygamy. Heber J. Grant has been pro polygamy up to this point. John W. Taylor, Mariner Merrill, Matthias F. Cowley, Roger Clausen. And then the next four junior to them are Reed Smoot, Hiram Mack Smith, George Albert Smith, and Charles W. Penrose.
And all of those are for or against? Those last four.
Charles Penrose had, in his youth, always been very pro polygamy. I believe he was probably a practicing polygamist, but at this point, being made a general authority is probably towing the line of public appeal, because he's also one of the attorneys and he wrote the manifesto and helped write it. So I think that's kind of the way he's going more with that. I know that George Albert Smith was kind of friends with Joseph Musser. And George Albert Smith is the son of John Henry Smith, but he never entered the principal. And Hiram Mack Smith, I think Hiram Mack Smith is a son of Joseph F. Smith and brother to future president of the church, Joseph Fielding Smith.
Okay.
And he never entered the principal either, but I don't know if I could say that he was against it, but being a junior member and probably not being aware of these intricate inner circles that we've been discussing, probably wasn't in favor of it either. Yeah, he wasn't against it, but wasn't promoting it, I should say.
So you think Lyman could have had influence over those junior members to sway?
Easy. Him and with him and between him and Penrose, if they were agreed, yeah, they would have. So you have a split right down the middle, 6-6.
And Penrose is problematic because I know that when the church stopped conferring priesthood and just started ordaining right to the office, that was according to Penrose. So Heber J. Grant would say, I'm not a theologian. When it comes to matters of theology, I defer to Penrose. Right?
There's a beautiful talk on the Godhead in the last volume of the Journal of Discourses that I really love from Charles Penrose. It's about the Godhead and exaltation and how we become exalted and all that. It's really a good talk. Given in about 1886 or so. But I don't know fully what the deal was or what happened. And I'm not saying Charles Penrose is a bad person, but yeah, definitely not our guy in this fight for sure. Right.
Definitely not our guy for the continuation of conferring priesthood either.
No. So we're split down the middle. So from 1901, we went with a complete unanimous to 1905. We're split right down the middle, which is going to change because Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor get dropped right after this, right? They haven't been dropped yet, but they've signed their resignation letters. And members of the first presidency, however, are Joseph F. Smith, and Anthony H. Lund, and John R. Winder. Those are faithful people right there.
Right.
So we have letters from the first presidency secretary telling Reed Smoot not to sacrifice Cowley and Taylor. Family tradition from the Taylor family says that Janet Taylor, or Nettie Taylor, Nettie Woolley Taylor, told her son that Joseph F. Smith, at the time of the resignations in 1905, had said to John W. and Cowley, quote, "You brethren are called upon to make the sacrifice, but you will lose nothing from it. When things quiet down, you will be reinstated."
Interesting. How would they have done that?
I don't know.
How would they have done that? Because you're going to find replacements for those.
Yeah, that's true.
Unless
brought into the first presidency
maybe
as counselors.
Yeah, maybe, perhaps. Yeah. That would
have been a public outrage if they'd done that. Oh, I don't know.
I would have loved to have seen it though.
Oh yeah. I mean, for after all that being said and done in the Reed Smoot hearings for President Smith to bring John W. and Matthias Cowley into the first presidency, oof. Yeah, that would have been great.
Well,
But
and
just
to
what's up?
me, I just can't shake the feeling that Lyman is behind all of this. I'm guessing he's already got anti-polygamy guys waiting in the wings to take those seats.
Yeah, that's possibly true.
I'm just guessing. I'm theorizing.
Let's see. Yes and no, because who replaces them are George F. Richards. He's kind of against it, and he was responsible for changing the temple ordinances in 1923. So George F. Richards, Orson F. Whitney, and David O. McKay.
Okay. David O. McKay, we've already covered, is kind of sympathetic.
And so is Orson F. Whitney.
Okay.
So very interesting. Let's see. Matthias Cowley writes to one of John W. Taylor's sons later in 1937 and says regarding these events, when we were in council relative to our trouble, Brother Penrose remarked, these brethren are not on trial, nor have they committed any offense, but if they are willing to offer the sacrifice and stand the embarrassment, we will admit them back after the situation clears, or words to that effect.
Is there any indication that John W. Taylor really thinks this is going to happen? That he's going to be reinstated? Is there anything from his journals that state, oh yeah, I'm good? I would be curious to know what his thoughts were about him signing this resignation, if he honestly thought he'd be brought back in.
His own words at one point were, I have been sacrificed for Reed Smoot's political ambitions.
You want to talk about one of the moments that has to backfire is not only do we as Mormons during this time period sacrifice a good man so that Reed Smoot could get elected, but later Reed Smoot would single-handedly be responsible for the deepening of a loss of wealth that this country hasn't seen ever since. Talk about reaping what you sow.
That's a good correlation, like you said. I think I would share one more thing, and I think maybe we stop this episode because it's a good stopping point.
Okay.
And we can discuss it obviously and just go where it takes us. But so we're entering into 1906. We know what has been decided by the Quorum of the 12. And this is what Heber J. Grant has to say about it at this point in his life. He writes in his journal on January 5th, 1906, what they have done, I have done, or intended to do. And in so doing, I would have done what I thought had the approval of my brethren. Brother John Henry can tell you of the Brown and Romney cases when we were in Mexico, and of my protest and of the final action. Before I went to Japan, my president intimated that I had better take the action needed to increase my family. It is circumstances that have prevented me from being guilty. I claim no credit. So he's almost lamenting that he wasn't in the same position as they were. Or he's wishing that he had been as valiant as they had been. And he says the only difference is between me and them. I would have done what they did. I had no opportunity with the same motive.
Ooh. Is this where Heber, you think, kind of starts to go sour?
I start to see from the journal records I have in about a year or two, the tone starts to change, but it's not fully right now.
To me, this smacks of a man who has some envy, right? And later, I think that envy will turn into something like, if we can just forget about this, maybe I can forget about my own shame.
I think it really is a tragedy to see a man who's called by revelation like he was with, and you can see the counterpart with George Teasdale, and he's been pretty faithful, and it looks like Heber J would have been faithful too. And I don't know, maybe he says, and he's lamenting over the lack of opportunity, but what could have been different maybe if the pursuits of his own life had been a little different in regards to business versus being more active in going for those kind of things. Those things don't just, I mean, they'll come to you if you're lucky. I'm not saying that they don't ever come to you, but you got to work for them generally. You can't say
Right.
it's just going to come to you if it, you know, put it in the Lord's hand. You know, it's, you have every once in a while that an angel will come or a visitor will tell you this is, or a vision will be given to you that is saying this is the wife that you'll marry, or this is the husband that you'll have, but he's already married to another lady. You know, in the case
Right.
for them, yeah. But it's, those things have to be worked for and labored for if you want them. But
Right.
generally speaking, and it looks like what we see is a lot of people, and we will see this in the future going forward, is people asking, can this be done? You know, Joseph Summerhays asked Joseph F. Smith, can this be done? And 6 years later, he's being told by President Smith to go perform plural marriages down in
Right.
Mexico.
Mm. Yeah, because we don't have a lot. Do we have many records? I should probably phrase this in a question because I don't know. Do we have a lot of evidence that Heber J. Grant was performing plural marriages?
We have the one that he mentions with he married a brother Brown and a brother Romney in Mexico, um, under the direction of John Henry Smith. It looks like while there was initial protest, it's causing him to have a lot of sympathy for Brother Taylor and Brother Cowley at this exact moment in history. But he also, remember, when he was in California, as in the mission field, he told some of the missionaries who were in the field, who had wives at home, who could not have children, that if you come to me, we can go down to Mexico and we can we can get you another wife so that you can have some children. So he was in favor of that. He told in the Reed Smoot hearings that he was going to continue to marry and cohabitate with his wives until he had a son, because the sons that he had up to this point had died in their youth. And there is even a story told by Reuel Allred that in about 1923, when Heber J. Grant was president of the church, and when the Cardston Temple was dedicated, that Byron Harvey Allred Jr., who had married Mary Evelyn Clark, Reuel's mother, in Mexico, they had found their way up to Canada, and Byron Allred goes to President Grant, who's there for the dedication. He asks Heber J. Grant, this was done down there in Mexico. Can we redo it? Can we have it redone in the temple now? And Heber J. Grant said, yes, well, we can reseal that and make it a matter of record.
He's such an enigma because we have our theories about when he turns, but it's like he turns and then he turns back, right? And there's this tension with Heber that we never really get fully resolved on when he just flips that switch.
Yeah, I don't know. The Epistle of James in the New Testament says that a double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways.
Well, yeah.
And that's what it sounds like to me. But at the same time, I can't say he didn't do some good work, you know, and but there definitely was a turning point. And I think even before 1923, he had pretty much changed his mind. I think Byron Allred was given an exception because his marriage to his second wife had occurred in 1901, so it's before Second Manifesto. That ends up kind of being the litmus test for how things are handled. So what happens is, jumping forward in the future, in 1909, Francis M. Lyman starts to do serious investigations regarding everything that's happening with new plural marriages. And basically, the line of demarcation is, if it was before April 6th, 1904, we will not excommunicate you, but if it's found out to be and publicized that you have taken a wife between the Woodruff Manifesto and the Second Manifesto, we'll keep you in the church. But if you have a calling of high leadership, we're going to ask you to leave your. We're going to drop you from your calling, but you retain your membership. But if it's after the second one, you lose your membership.
See, and that's fascinating because that's the exact opposite of what originally happened under Brigham Young when he thought like the practice was just not being lived, where he said, if you don't, he was looking at people who were in high leadership, stake presidents, those sorts of things, bishops. If you don't take another wife, we're going to get rid of you. I find that it's fascinating how those tables turned that quick.
Yeah, me too. Me too. But we're going to get into, in the next episode, some more of the catalysts. Basically, what I think are the seeds of the fundamentalist movement that are born in this area. I really think that that's we're going to start to cover the marriages done by Judson Tolman in the next episode.
Okay, awesome.
And Judson Tolman was patriarch of Davis County, and which is where John Woolley ends up being patriarch as well. Yeah,
dude, man, this has been so fascinating to like. I really don't think even those who know about post manifesto polygamy, the level of carefulness and dogged determination to keep this thing going is insane. And to see these men fight for it in such a way, and to have the story, I think, finally told in its completeness, right? Without spin, without just honest history, is something that I don't think we as a community have had before. And dude, you're doing a great job, and I can't wait for our next conversation.
Sweet. Hey, I appreciate the opportunity to get this out there. I don't know if I've told you this or the listeners this before, but I've wanted to do something on this time period ever since I pretty much came into fundamentalism. And I'm just grateful to the Lord that He's allowed me to compile it, because I had no idea where to start, and things just fell into place when I had a friend ask me one question, and I said, I'll try to put something together on you, and it just spiraled into this whole deal after I was trying to answer that question. And so,
well, and I think this should, men like Cowley and Taylor and Joseph F. Smith, going back, we owe them such a debt of gratitude. Such a debt of gratitude. And it's been an unfortunate outcome that within a lot of Mormonism, these men's names have just been lost. And I hope that this changes it. I hope that this maybe puts them back into their proper light.
Well, on that note, I want to read something that I thought it was funny, and I couldn't let it sit. And it has reference to Matthias Cowley, and so it's might as well just bring it up now, based on what you just said. I was on Facebook, and let's see if I can find them. Someone posted a quotation from a letter that Matthias Cowley wrote to Byron Harvey Allred Jr., that's Reuel Allred's dad, in 1925. And I'm going to see if I can find it. So December 8th, 1925, Matthias Cowley writes to Byron Harvey Allred. And sorry to spoil some things, but this is 11 years after he practically sued for his life to retain his church membership. And he says to Byron Allred, who, by the way, Byron Harvey Allred was mission companions to Loren Woolley, and obviously heavily into fundamentalism later. He writes to him saying, if the authorities of the church make mistakes, it is not our prerogative to set them right. And when we consider how well the church general authorities have lived good, clean, chaste lives, been faithful to the duties of their ministry at home and abroad, we must admit that if any man or set of men are worthy to know God's will, it is they to whom we vote to uphold and sustain, and that with all their failings, they are the best men in the earth and in the world. And so, dear brother, let us not be doubtful of them, but true and faithful to them. And I promise you this in the name of the Lord, if you stand by and uphold the authorities of this church, God himself will stand by you and sustain you in this life and exalt you in the life to come. So that got cited by someone in the church, showing that even Cowley changed his mind near the end of his life, or in an effort basically to support the attitude that we're here to protest a little bit, which is follow your leaders blindly, follow arbitrary counsel, just do what you're said, the Lord will bless you. But that's not what Brother Cowley's saying at all. But my counter in public on the internet was posting another quote of Matthias Cowley that he gave in 1901 at the Logan Temple, saying, "None of the revelations of the prophets, either past or present, have been repealed. If you have a teacher in your Sunday schools who would encourage you to disregard or disrespect a single doctrine of the church, plural marriage and all, turn them out. They have no right in the priesthood."
Ooh. Weighing it down.
So that's how he felt, really. And that's what got him into trouble. But he would have continued down that road. And I believe he were contrary to what people citing that letter would want it to make it, what they would like it to make it seem like. We see Matthias Cowley troubling with pro-fundamentalist people as late as 1922 in his life.
Okay. So he never lost that zeal.
Not fully, not completely. After 1922, he didn't want to be involved with organizing when Lauren Woolley started to want to organize, but I don't think he ever lost a connection to that community. That was the underground community, or his own duties in the priesthood, because he was told, and we're skipping way ahead now, but we got into it. He was told not to exercise his priesthood for years. When he retained his membership in 1911 when he was disfellowshipped, but he was not allowed to exercise his priesthood. But we see from Nathaniel Baldwin's journals in the 1920s that he was going around giving blessings to people.
Good for him.
Yep.
Good for him. Because despite what some would have you say, priesthood does exist outside the church.
Yep. And according to family tradition, in addition to what is recorded in those journals about him exercising his priesthood in that instance, he also had a ceremony with John W. Taylor, according to Taylor family tradition in Utah Lake, where him and a president of a stake rebaptized John W. Taylor back into the church after his excommunication, which was likely, if I were to venture a guess, was probably his brother, Frank Y. Taylor, being the stake president.
Right.
But I don't know that entirely.
Fascinating stuff. And we'll cover that more, I'm guessing, in an episode or so.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. All right, dude. Thanks a lot.
No problem at all.
All right. Bye, everybody.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.